evening, everyone. Thanks for coming. Thanks for the nice introduction. I'm sorry I'm a little late. There was lots of traffic, but I'm happy I'm here. I just came from New York last night, and it was snowing there, and it was pretty cold. So even though there's lots of traffic and everything is extremely slow in Miami, it's warm and sunny. So I feel good, and I'm excited to be here. And I'm particularly excited to see so many people in the audience. And, it's very nice. Usually there's only like 3 people who come. One is my daughter, the other one is my mother, and maybe one friend. Anyway, this is just so I want. All right, I'm going to talk to you tonight about one particular exhibition, and this is an exhibition that I've curated at the Jewish Museum last year, which I think very much summarizes my particular curatorial approach, and in a way also a particular trend within curating, which has to do with self-reflexive turn curating, which includes, I think, also an engagement with the history of exhibitions. And during the introduction, we already heard about one particular publication that I authored that was published last year by James and Hudson, which is called Showtime, the most important contemporary exhibitions since 1990. And in that exhibition, I'm looking at 50 exhibitions that, in my opinion, have shifted our understanding of exhibition making and curating, and as a sort of result of many different factors. One of which is, of course, globalization. The art world expanded, and we were all of a sudden confronted with a much bigger territory to look at. Another one was certainly that curators began to work much more creatively with exhibitions, which perhaps is a result of the influence of artistic practices on curating, I think in particular conceptual art or institutional critique. So this exhibition that I'm going to talk about is an exhibition that responds to another exhibition, an exhibition that was extremely important, not only in the history of art, but even more so in the history of the institution that I'm working at, where I'm the deputy director and where I'm in charge of the exhibitions and public program, which is the Jewish Museum in New York. And in 1966, the Jewish Museum presented an exhibition that was called Primary Structures, an exhibition that was curated by a curator named Sinister McShine. And it sort of became one of the most iconic exhibitions in post-American art history due to the fact that it, for the very first time, brought together a group of artists that then later on would be considered minimalists. And if you look at the list of artists that were included in the first exhibition, in this Primary Structures exhibition in 1966, you will see all the names that you associate with this particular art movement, everyone from Donald Judd to Richard Serra and Carl Andre and so on. We're going to look at this a little later on. One of the interesting things about this exhibition, however, was when I looked at it, that in contrast to the globalized art world that I encountered when I began working as a curator in the mid-90s, was that this exhibition exclusively included artists from North America and Britain, but no artists from any other countries or other regions or continents. And obviously, as you probably all know, there has been a big effort also in Eastern Europe, Asia, Latin America, and even Africa in regards to the minimalism and considerations of minimalist art and sculpture. So I wanted to somehow explore how would have that show in 1966 looked like if the world of art had been as globalized as it is now. And this is the historic Marburg Mansion. This is on 92nd Street and 5th Avenue, where we are located. It was a former residence of the Marburg family, and Felix Warburg, who owned the building, is in fact the brother of Avi Warburg, who many of you probably know as a well-known art historian. And back at that point, this is the way the museum looked like. There was a contemporary wing that doesn't exist any longer. It was taken down in the 90s and it was replaced by another building that is similar in style to, or basically identical in style than the sort of faux Gothic mansion that has been there since over 100 years. This is the cover of the original publication, Primary Structures. This has been designed by Locust Cohen. Anyone who's interested in know that sound is changing for some reason? Locust Cohen was a graphic designer who worked a lot with the Jewish Museum, and this is probably one of her most iconic designs. And she is also a painter. She's still alive and still practices, and actually is quite close to the museum. And when we began working on the exhibition, I went to visit her and was thinking that somehow I wanted to reuse this graphic design that she had developed. And I'm going to show you how we did that in a second. So this is the list of the artists that were in the original exhibition. And have a look there, you see Andre, Archibald, Valerie Bell, Ronald Clayton, Anthony Caro, Anthony Maria, and Flavin, and so on. Basically, the who is who of minimal art from the US and the UK. But most of the artists that we still remember are the ones from the US, that Bridget didn't do so well. So we had 42 artists and 51 works in the original exhibition. This is the floor plan of the museum, and this is how all of those original works of art were installed. So I began looking at this exhibition from 1966, going through the archives of the museum and really having to rebuild the entire thing based on photographs, little sketches, notes. There wasn't really any plans left anymore that would tell me how exactly the original show was installed. But it gives you kind of a good idea of how busy that exhibition was. And I have more images to show you also from the original show. This was on the second floor. You see Donald Judd there, Larry Bell, Solowick, Robert Morris. Third floor, which actually had a very big gallery that we're going to see in a bigger image in a second. Here's just like some images of how the original show in '66 was installed. This is out on Fifth Avenue with the Anthony Smith. This is a courtyard. And then you came into the building, and you see the Robert Smithson and Judy Garowitz, who's now called Judy Chicago. She changed her name after this exhibition. And became very well known, much more for her work related to feminism than to her work here with the minimal sculptures. Just some impressions here of how that show was installed 50 years ago. So, why was I interested in this? As I said in the beginning, it was really the most iconic show in the history of the museum, and I wanted to go back to a moment that I felt this institution really pushed the envelope. And also one that was very well remembered because it introduced all these artists to the art. And you have to remember 1966, Donald Judd wasn't Donald Judd. Donald Judd was just some other Donald. Nobody had actually really heard of him till this point. So it was a show that had an incredible impact on how we understand art history, for American art history, and particularly, of course, minimalism. Here we have these cubes by Larry Bell, and then next to it, this is Solowick. So I wanted to go back to it and thinking about how it was displayed, what choices were made, how were they made. Obviously, realizing very quickly where can this damage shine, what is information from, and where he did research. And it was an interesting period to look at this particular exhibition and really researching it in depth. So then, as a result, I organized an exhibition that was called Other Primary Structures instead of Primary Structures. And the term other, of course, refers to the idea of additional. but of course also to the other as in something that is foreign or alien or marginalized to a certain extent. This is how the files look like at the museum. So we have quite a lot of the stuff still there, and it's very well organized. We had a lot of images. You know, this is actually how I found the box. It's like, my archive doesn't look like that. So this is some other images. This is statements of the artist, which was really interesting. I even found the old long forms. This is the one where Dan Fleming loans his piece to the museum. And then this is the publication. And so I decided that I wanted to reprint the original book and then make a second book that would come along cited and ready for the opening of the exhibition. And I used exactly the same format, exactly the same graphic design, only with like little twists. So if you see, the yellow one is the original one, where it sort of had place between the S and the P, like primary structures, and I introduced then the O, which then of course stands for other primary structures. They were both then coming together in a slipcase, so you had both next to each other, but they were almost identical, even to the extent that I had the same words count for my essay, and very meticulously following the original one. So here is a sketch for how we translated that original graphic design into the design for the exhibition. I conceived of a very big timeline. This was sort of like an alternative timeline of the history of minimal art, looking at main events around minimal art that occurred in Eastern Europe, in Latin America, in Africa, sort of presenting the whole history that wasn't considered or hasn't really become part of the canon till now. So I used all these colors from that original book. And here I was thinking, how do I bring the original show back into my show? And I came up with this idea of these photomurals and placed the photomurals more or less at the same spots where the original artworks were. So if you would have come to the original show, this is what you would have seen in that gallery at that point in 1966. Sort of like a very inexpensive and unscientific way of time travel. You just sort of like have that thing there. And in front of them photomurals, I placed the new works. So if you sort of like looked at certain angles, it was really like sort of imposing the new work upon the ones that were already there. But it's at the same time also cancelling that history out in a certain way. There were moments when I did that actually quite drastically. And then in the very last phase of the exhibition, I had a group of architectural students from Parsons built this beautiful model of the Warburg Mansion of the museum, very meticulously built, and inside it we had a reconstruction of the entire original exhibition in miniature. So it's basically a dollhouse filled with minimal art. And a friend of mine from San Francisco who had worked with me on another show that was similar, where we also did a model of a historically important exhibition, built all these artworks based on descriptions and photographs and so on for the exhibition. What was interesting is that there hasn't been any color photography of the original primary structural exhibition. So we had to either go to the artist or to the estate, sometimes the widows, to ask them, oh, what color was that? And it was so incredible to see the models installed inside the building, because we only knew this exhibition from black and white photography. So it became almost a completely different exhibition. So we had 42 of these little pieces. So this is again the original list of artists, and then this is my list of artists, part 1 and part 2. And the reason for part 1 and part 2 was that for the original show, Minister McShine was able to use the entire building, and I was not. I just had one floor. And of course I was still ambitious and wanted to show as many artists as possible. And so I decided, well, why don't I do 2 parts? First part is 3 months long, and the second part is 3 months long. But give it also sort of a conceptual structure. So the first part was all about artworks coming out of that particular minimal aesthetics that were made between 1960 till 66. So basically sort of like looking at what had happened before Kynaston did the show. And then part two was what happened after 66, after the show actually opened at the museum. And it's quite interesting to see the difference there, because some of the artists in part two responded directly to primary structures, particularly the artists from Argentina that were in the second part, who after the primary structures exhibition in New York organized the exhibition Estructuras Primeras in Buenos Aires, where they made minimal sculptures themselves about 6 to 8 months after the show closed in New York. So now I'm going to show you a couple of images of the exhibition that I put together. And I just already spoke about this idea of like cancelling out the history and playing around with this in a little bit creative and playful way. So this piece here, the big sculpture, is a piece by Naomi Escandel. And what was interesting to me about this was that she made a drawing for this piece in 1964, but it was never executed. She didn't have the means or the space to execute it. And it existed only as a drawing. And when I started working on the exhibition, I started getting in touch with her and said, you know, where's this piece? And she said, well, I've never done it, only a drawing, but if you want, we could do it now. So it's like made in 64 as an idea, but executed in 2014. And it is a giant X. It goes all the way to the ceiling, and the dimensions are dependent on where this piece is shown, but since this was the first time it was shown, so it only ever existed really once in these dimensions. And it stands right in front of this big photo mural, instead of almost sitting there as an X that sort of like cancels out something that exists already. And then in the back you see this blue cube and the four sort of red brownish floor sculpture. So this is an artist. He organized an exhibition at the Hayward Gallery. It was very, very influential. That was a response to the very well-known and iconic Magician de la Terre exhibition that happened in 1989, organized by Jean-Pierre Martin, which is by and large now considered to be the first large-scale exhibition that brought together Western and non-Western artists. And as you can tell, Jean-Pierre's show, Magician de la Terre, the title in itself already was sort of a provocation, thinking about artists from non-Western context as magicians, rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. And so Rashid decided to organize an exhibition at the Hayward Gallery with artists who came from former British colonies and were now living in the UK. This exhibition took place in 1992 at the Hayward Gallery. It was called Other Stories. And as you can see, other stories and other primary structures. I was trying to make a relationship there also to Rashid's exhibition. This is a work by a Filipino artist called David Medela, who also lived in London for a very long time. He published a magazine called Signals. Signals was really the only magazine that in the 60s and 70s exclusively looked at artists from Asia and Latin America, even though it was published in England by David. And this is a piece that is called Cloud Canyons, and it's a machine, very, very simple machine. It's sort of like a machine that puts bubbles into a bucket, and the bucket is filled with this liquid you use to make cleaner dishes. But it produces these enormously beautiful bubble sculptures. And there's actually a cylinder, a plexiglass cylinder around them, and then constantly moving up and then disappear. So it sort of has this kinetic character to it, and in contrast, of course, to a lot of other minimal sculpture that is static and very much present and heavy. You have this very light and constantly changing artwork that consists only of these very ephemeral bubbles. This was an interesting gallery for me because here we only have artworks that are suspended from the ceiling. The inspiration for that came from that piece that is in that photo mural there that was also suspended from the ceiling. And then in the back there you see actually a piece by Carl Gray. So I often also work with these viewing accesses to sort of integrate the previous exhibitions into the new one. And here you have a piece by Ego, a German Jewish artist who lived in Caracas, Pedro Chica, and what's his name? The Polish artist who does the blue line. Someone help me. Kaczynski, Edward Kaczynski. I think there was one other piece that is not in this image, but they were all suspended. These Kaczynski pieces were actually pieces that the estate of Kaczynski only recently found. Kaczynski had a house that he rented out to a woman who had just passed away in 2012, and really, I mean, this is almost too good to be true. Under the roof, they found a couple of boxes where they discovered these previously unknown works. They were immediately sold to the Museum of Modern Art, which was kind enough to lend them to us before they were actually displayed in their collection. Alessandro Puente here in the middle. Of course, in the back here you recognize the soloist. So I was also interested in thinking about shapes like rectangles and spheres and triangles. This is actually one of the pieces that was remade that didn't exist, which is another interesting story about the history of a lot of these artists. There were no museums that could collect their work. They didn't have the means to store these pieces. So a lot of the stuff was actually destroyed and had to be remade, which the triangle piece is one of those. And now, this is the second part 2 of other primary structures. Happened 3 months later. I left the photo murals exactly the same way they were in the original show and the first part, and only exchanged the work. This beautiful yellow snake sculpture there is a piece by Oscar Boni, who's also an Argentinian artist. He was one of the artists that actually participated in the Estructuras Primeras in 1967 in Buenos Aires. So you see the same photo murals. This was actually the gallery in which we had artworks suspended. This was the gallery we just saw the Puente piece. There was a lot of artworks in the second part that came from Asia. And all of the work, of course, related to a model. We actually saw the model already walking through the exhibition at a particular point. And in the last room, we also had copies of the original publication and a lot of information about the original show in vinyl, including a checklist of all the works that were in the previous show that then would correspond with the miniature pieces in the model itself. We had little numbers, like little pins that would sit next to it. Yeah, this is already the last slide, so I kind of rushed through this a little bit. I can talk a little bit more about images. So this is actually the second exhibition that I reconsidered, and even though, of course, the history of exhibitions has mostly been considered from a sort of art historical perspective, or at least through the medium of writing, I myself primarily consider myself an exhibition maker. So looking at the history of exhibitions somehow had to lead for me to engage with this particular history through making an exhibition. And of course there's publications going along with those shows too. So the first exhibition that I reconsidered was When Attitudes Become Form, which was an exhibition that also took place in the 1960s. I realized that there was an extreme fascination for that particular period. for the 60s or the late 60s. And often sort of like a nostalgia for that period that came from the fact that I think the younger artists considered that period to be like the last period where there was actually real change possible, and where artists were still extremely radically questioning what the art system was, and you know what society was all about, and what art's function within that was. And of course, it was also fueled by a lot of songs that came out of the sort of emancipation movements of that period, whether that was, you know, feminism or the anti-war, anti-Vietnam movement, and so on. So looking at the work of these younger artists, I saw that, you know, some of the reference those artists from the original exhibition from When Attitudes Become Form very directly, and others would, you know, touch upon it rather loosely. But I noticed that there was a really strong relationship. So I did something similar to what I did with other primary structures. So the original show was called When Attitudes Become Form, and my exhibition was titled When Attitudes Became Form, Become Attitudes. And you entered the exhibition space, and there was one room, very similar to this exhibition, that had a model of the Kunsthaus band with the original installation. And there we had a little bit more material. There was material from the Swiss television that provided us with interviews with many of the artists. And very similar to primary structure, it was again an extremely important, influential, iconic exhibition with many artists that then later on became very well known. And there's actually some overlaps also with primary structures. But think about artists like Joseph and Lawrence Wiener and Mel Bogner and Alan Ruppersberg, really like a whole group of conceptual artists, then a whole group of Italian artists like Michelangelo Pistoletto and Mario Merz and so on. So highly influential. And then in my version of the show, you would then go out of that reference room, as I call it, and then encounter an entire exhibition of works by younger artists. I would say artists perhaps between 25 and 45, that all had made work that in some way responded to the work of the artist in When Attitudes Become Form. I structured the exhibition very similar to the way that Seemann had done it, looking at work that related to minimalism or more conceptual ideas or more to the body, or perhaps thinking more about land art. And so these are sort of two examples of exhibitions that I curated in the last couple of years that engage with the history of art on the one hand, and then the history of exhibition making on the other. So sort of like looking back, and I think primary structures was important, particularly for me, because of my engagement with the Jewish Museum now, and thinking about the future of our museum there, and how we want to further develop, and kind of like looking back in order to look forward, and going back to a period that was extremely important for our museum.
Can you repeat the name of the graphic designer?
Elaine Lasker Cohen.
Lasker Owen?
Cohen, Lasker Cohen.
Do you consider yourself an artist when you're curating these exhibitions?
No, I don't. But it's interesting that you've been like probably the 100th person that has asked you this question. And I think the reason for that is that the exhibitions often are quite creative, and perhaps less sort of like bound by traditions of traditional exhibition making, that perhaps it's art, it's more thinking academically about the history of art, but not at all. In fact, I would have to really always emphasize very much that I'm an exhibition maker, and what I'm trying to do is try to create a diversification of our understanding of exhibition models. So I don't think that the exhibitions necessarily always have to take place in the white cube, and I think that there's a lot of possibilities in exhibitions that we haven't even touched upon yet, and that there's a lot to explore when it comes to making exhibitions, and we somehow sort of pulled back due to traditions or orthodoxies that I would like to break through with these type of exhibitions. And in a way, if you will, you can go a step further and think perhaps that these orthodoxies and traditions and conventions are what ultimately somehow shape our life in general. And so these are little examples of how we can maybe break through that overall, not only in art, but not only in exhibition making, but in life in general.
Hi. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about how you personally felt when you discovered that there was this really cool historical show that you wanted to re-engage with and bring forward. And if there was anything that really sticks out, in your mind of something that was serendipitous, something that happened that you didn't expect would happen, you were able to before. Just a little bit about how you felt about this really cool thing personally.
Well, one of the things that I'm very interested in is looking back in history. History is a very important tool to understand, why we are, what has shaped us, what has created our identity in a way. Of course, a museum is like the accumulation of all of that history that then is put out there in order to make us understand, help us with, finding our own identity, certainty. And of course, all of this is in flux very much. And I think this particular exhibition, Other Primary Structures, is very much about that, that you have a certain understanding of art and what society, civilization in general. And, now there's this whole other world to discover, and all of a sudden, something that we took for granted is completely challenged. Which also, it's so interesting in a way that it also really brought to canonizing or building canons to it. There's so many different possibilities there now, all of a sudden, seeing so many more things to consider. And I was also thinking, what is the history of my own profession, and what has been done before, and how has that been done, and what were the influential or the key moments in that development of making exhibitions. So, of course, when Attitudes Become Form is probably the most iconic and most talked about exhibition in the history of exhibition making of the last 50 years. And I had the fortune, I was fortunate enough to actually meet Harald Thiemann in person several times and interview him on one occasion about his experience with when Attitudes Become Form. That interview was on my computer, transcribed, and I never used it. And then when I was doing that exhibition in the catalog, I was finally able to use that material and have Thiemann speak about this exhibition. So you heard his ideas and thoughts out of his own mouth.
Do you have a list of those artists?
In I don't have the list with me, but I'm very happy. Actually, maybe it's online. So here's a list of all the artists that I included. Have a look. So it was a huge exhibition. Maybe some of those artists are familiar to you, maybe some others not. But what was important to me was that it was a very wide group of artists, a lot of artists from many different countries and regions of the world. Again, Thiemann in Attitudes Become Form did not include many female artists, neither of the shows, but there were only 2 female artists in each of the shows. And then if I had wasn't one, it was actually both shows. And then, sorry? For this exhibition, what did he do? It was a piece where he had, you're talking about Tino Segal, and the question was, what did Tino Segal do for this exhibition? And it was a piece that is called This Exhibition. And you come to the exhibition space in the guard in front of you, you collapse in front of you, and then starts reciting the press release of the exhibition. So it's basically an introduction to the exhibition, to this guard that collapses, but you can't really fully understand it because it almost seems like the guard has an epileptic shock or something like this, and then he stands up and says the title of the piece and makes it clear that this was a piece by Tino Segal. Let me just see, I can even show you a couple of images. So this is this reference from that I talked about before. And this is a model that I talked about, similar to the big house that we did at the Jewish Museum. It's sort of like a simpler version of a model of the Kunsthaus in Bern, where we had the recreation of when entities become formed. And this is a whole wall with photographs that were taken during the installation. This was actually the Kunsthaus house, the facade. So when you entered the new exhibition, you had to walk through the entrance of the old museum. Just sort of like a few impressions. This was the original publication, and similarly to the primary structures catalog, this publication has become sort of like a collector's item and extremely iconic. And in this case, I also then repeated the graphic design of it. Here, just a few installation shots of how the exhibition was laid out. Obviously, the Walters Institute is a much more contemporary space. It's more sort of like a structure. Like here, slightly bigger, but not this grand old mansion that we have in New York. Just a few impressions here. But you see, it's extremely dense and full of work material. Yeah, so that is that.
In the original primary structure show, in looking at that show, I always have this impression because some of the images of, maybe now I question because of the images being black and white, this impression that I had that the Judy Chicago sculpture felt very feminine, but I think it was also because, I guess it was the image hand colored, or there was a color image that I've seen of that work in the past. So
yeah, it could be that you saw the piece on another reproduction and another occasion.
Maybe. So in seeing the works now, my question is that once the works got brought to life in color in the model, I think of minimalism as having this masculine edge, and that work that I Chicago into it feeling sort of different. But when you look at the model and all the works are so colorful, it has a very different feel. So I was just wondering, I guess, was there a shift in the way you read the works once you saw them in color?
Well, I mean, it goes a little bit back to the other question that we had before, was there a moment of surprise or something? And I think that certainly was the biggest surprise in working on this recreation or reconsideration, that all of a sudden we were confronted with all of those works in color. And not color, they were, I mean, extremely colorful, like really into your head and into your face. So that was that. Yeah, no, but I mean, it was just something that was there in the model itself, and I mean, most of the pieces I've never seen in person, so there's still a sort of like distance to the whole thing.
There was something that was feminine about those works that was different from the other works in the show, or no?
No, I don't think that Julie Chicago's was now extremely feminine just because it was color. I mean, there were other pieces that may be even more colorful. So I wouldn't necessarily say that. The model, I mean, it was important that I really wanted to give the audience a chance to sort of like see how did the original show look like, but not really recreating it. It would have been completely awkward if I would have done this kind of creepy almost, bringing something back to life. If I would have some of you know him, he's also a conceptual artist, very politically engaged, and we had a conversation. He mentioned an article that he had read by a mathematician who had come up with a formula of how to measure originality and creativity. And he said that for something for us to be considered original or new, or have a particular form of creativity, it's just about 2 to 3% deviation of something that already existed. If it would be more than these 2 or 3%, we would not recognize it as something new anymore. The deviation would be too big, and there wasn't enough affirmation for us to understand that this was actually something new. And that was interesting to me to think about that in regards to other primary structures. So basically, even though there's photo murals and there's colors and there's a model, it's still an exhibition in a museum with wall text, with labels, with artworks, with an introductory wall text, with a publication, etc., etc. So that was interesting. How like sometimes the perception of how radical things seem to be is so different than how they actually are.
Did you communicate with the original artists about taking the structures, their sculptures, and turning them into black and white photography? And did they become, Were they just a backdrop? And because that's kind of an artist action that you took there.
Yeah,
Like the Louise Waller action, you know, like you made your own artwork.
But the photographs existed, right? They were small. They were documents from the original show. Exactly. So what I did, I was just blowing them up so they were life size, so that you actually see also yourself and the new work in relation to the original work.
I'm just curious, did you ever communicate with the artists about now presenting them in a new format in the gallery? Because it was contradicting their original intention in the gallery.
I contacted every artist of that show to talk to them about the miniatures and also tell them about the photo murals. And I think there's only maybe out of those 40 guys, there's maybe like 12 left. Many of the other ones have unfortunately died.
So the living ones, did they have rejection?
There was no one that was, in fact, they went further. So we contact them, and of course then they show up at the museum and say, can we include a new work of mine into the show? So, this is the concept of the show, and, thanks for the portfolio. Sometimes it was a granddaughter of an artist, and my granddad was a really great artist, and he died 10 years ago, and I'm really happy that you're reconsidering it, and here's all the cash flows. So, you open a can of worms with those things sometimes. But it was nice. I mean, it was nice conversations, it was nice. Many of the artists actually came for the opening as well, and many of the artists that were still alive that went in sort of other primary structures also came from, many from Latin America and from Asia. Yes, please.
What's interesting about the show, generally in the past when museums do historic or revisit history, they go with the work that was originally done at the time, like let's say the Whitney does something on pop art. You would have Rosenquist, so you have all that. But you set up a very different dynamic when you revisit Kynaston's show and sort of change the conversation a little bit. And it's interesting that, when the Met did the Pictures Generation versus the Picture Show. So I'm curious, do you see that you're enlarging the conversation, changing the conversation, adding to the history, rewriting history? I mean, it sets up a lot of different dynamics between the original work and intention of the show and what you're doing, and it makes it almost three-dimensional in a way.
All of what you said, I think, is very much part of what I'm thinking about. But I have to also be very true and honest about this. This is one small little exhibition that introduces maybe 30 artists that have made minimal work in a particular period of time. I worked on this exhibition for 16 months, which is not necessarily really long if you have to do research like that. So I actually went for a lot of things that were perhaps rather obvious. If you are familiar with the history of minimalism in Latin America, you would have known most of the artists that I included there. So it could have been, if I would have done it on a scale of Guggenheim or MoMA, probably would have been able to include many more artists, get other loans. Many times I had to go for like my second or third choice because I couldn't get the piece. I just have to be really honest about that. So sometimes when I had a piece by Hibio Chica in the gallery, there could have been another more interesting one, but that was the only one that I could find at that particular moment. Lydia Clark was another situation. Obviously, she's very well known now, but she is a key figure of that neo-concrete movement in Brazil, and MoMA was setting up their retrospective of her work, and the estate and the gallery and MoMA completely refused to collaborate with me in any shape or form. So I had to sort of dig really deep, and luckily Miami came to the rescue. This Cisneros heard my cry and says, "Yeah, we're going to help you. We have a couple of the works, and we're going to borrow those for you." So thanks to them, we were able to actually have a couple of really beautiful videos in the exhibition. This is the other thing of exhibition making, that sometimes, especially when you work with historical material, it's never really obvious. This whole negotiation of loans and what works you can get from where and when is a highly complicated process that in the end is often not necessarily very visible. So it's like detective work when it comes to the research, and then it's a lot of arm wrestling, if you will, to get these things from people. A lot of schmoozing, a lot of flowers, lots of dinners. exhibition, and how do you juxtapose certain works, and how do you really install it, and for me there's two different things. Some curators, I would say, distribute works in a room, and then there's some curators who actually really install it and stage an exhibition. There's two very different things. And to me, the staging process and the installation is probably 35 to 40% of the entire program, really thinking carefully about how do you make these relationships. And you might not pick up on everything immediately when you walk through a show, but I think unconsciously you feel a certain harmony, a certain relationship between things, a certain flow. I'm thinking a lot about speeds, for example. How do you, slow the walk of the viewer down at a certain moment? How do you, pick up on it by having something in the back that maybe evokes your curiosity, shutting things down with another wall? I originally studied theater, so a lot of these ideas of dramaturgy and staging certainly have their roots within that education. And the photo murals are probably, they're extremely theatrical, so there's clear relationships to my formation as a theater director.
Well, it worked because the pacing was almost like walking through sort of like an amusement park or Disneyland, because you would walk and there'd be these big structures and then you walk somewhere else. So it did work. I mean,
well, when you think about the, early avant-garde years of the 20th century, a logical step could have been to get rid of the division between the stage and the audience, where it just becomes all one unhierarchical situation that is perhaps not that unlike what you experience when you come to an exhibition, where you become the performer in relationship to the other viewers, and you become the performer in relationship to the artworks. So it's this sort of theatrical relationship that also exists in an exhibition.
I was hoping you could elaborate on some of the comments you made earlier about going beyond the white cube, and what different areas or places that you would like to see some of the exhibitions that we are currently working on or in the future going to be working on, where could they take place?
I think what's really important to me is that they still continue to take place in museums and galleries, because there you have the biggest impact with changing the format of it. It's recognizable the most, the quickest. And actually also like to use traditional display devices like vitrines or pedestals. I like to work with wall labels, like very traditional tools that are at my disposal are very interesting to me, because I'm thinking about how can I change them, how can I create something different and new, but at the same time I also want you to feel familiar with them. I don't want to alienate you by doing something that is completely out of the box. I want you to feel familiar and engage with it, and then almost like the Trojan horse, send out the message that I have. So it's this sort of situation of bringing you in, making you feel familiar, and then kind of like sending out the message there. I'm not so interested in exhibitions that necessarily take place somewhere on the facade of the building, things like this. I mean, they certainly have their relevance, but there's not necessarily nice. So it's pretty much engaged within. And that's also to do with now, of course, with me working in this rather large institution and thinking what is the role and function of an art institution on the scale with so many different levels of programming and activity, and how do they relate to one another. So the museum as an institution, I'm mostly seeing it as an educational institution, as a big and important element in my thinking. How can I further develop this and make it even more relevant than it is already?
What are some of the conclusions you've been coming to?
Well, this is exactly what we're working on at the museum right now, thinking like, how can we create, one of the things that I found out about our museum, for example, is that our audience was used to a lot of hand-holding. They really wanted to have tours, they really wanted to have these little brochures, they wanted to basically have everything explained to them. So there was this attitude of pure consumption. as the audience, do not have to make an effort whatsoever, just feed it to us, and we just basically walking through this exhibition in a sort of half semi-conscious state. And I mean, I'm exaggerating here, but I really want to challenge that and see how can I, as a curator, or my group of curators there, make exhibitions that are perhaps less didactic in certain ways, or in these obvious ways, or and provide you with an experience of what is displayed there that is more direct, that is not so extremely mediated all the time.
Did you find your audience expanded as a result, or did you find sort of people left and?
Some people don't come back, some people come, and a new director was brought in, and then I was hired to think about the programming, and our desire was how can we, bring some of these earlier things back to life in terms of their radicality and how they were pushing the envelope, and look at, what were the elements that were really strong about, the period that just came before us, which was these incredible exhibitions that took place there that were, I think, are quite unique in terms of how they were, researched. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this exhibition, Action Abstraction, which was a big overview exhibition about abstract expressionism that took place at the Jewish Museum 5-6 years ago, organized by Norman Kleber. Right now we're having a show up by about the live collection of Helena Rubinstein. Again, that is a show that is effectively organized and researched, and I think this is where we have a little bit of a niche where I would like our museum to go. This sort of balance between some of these really well-made, well-crafted, well-researched historical exhibitions, and then perhaps some, more kind of adventurous, experimental undertakes, like other primary structures.
Wasn't the Helena Rubinstein exhibit discussed on NPR recently? I thought I heard a conversation about it in Parliament.
Yeah, absolutely. We got a lot of press with that for that exhibition, and has been extremely successful. So I'm very proud that we were able to do this show. And again, it was an incredible, difficult exhibition to follow. But it wasn't a show that I curated, an exhibition that Mason Klein has organized. I'm actually very proud about the fact that I have a whole group of curators there that I can say, okay, Norman or Mason, here you have 3 years, this is, go off and do the research and really dig deep and go for it. And not having them to have to worry about a lot of details and a lot of other stuff, but really being able to focus on these exhibitions, which is not necessarily always the case when curators work in institutions. Any other questions? You've had enough.
No?